The dust of West Texas was a language of its own, a fine, red powder that spoke of thirst and broken things. It settled in the creases of Eli Harper's worn-out shirt, in the lines around his eyes, and in the hollow space where his hope used to be. His horse was gone, sold for a pittance that had barely covered 2 nights in a flea-bitten boarding house and a week's worth of watery stew. Now the pittance was gone too. He stood on the edge of the town of redemption, a place that had offered him none, and felt the arid wind pull at him, as if trying to scour the last bit of substance from his bones. He was a cowboy without a horse, a man without direction, a ghost haunting the sun-bleached boardwalks. The despair was a physical weight pressing down on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. He had been adrift for months, but this was different. This was the bottom. This was the stillness before a man either gave up and died or did something desperate. It was in this state of quiet desperation that he first truly saw her. He had been aware of Maeve Callahan as one is aware of a mountain on the horizon, a permanent, unignorable feature of the landscape. She was a widow, a fact the town whispered with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. But it was her size that commanded attention. Maeve was a giant of a woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that looked capable of snapping fence posts in two. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that defied the cumbersome expectations her stature might suggest. When she entered the general store, the space seemed to shrink around her, the murmuring conversations faltering into a strained silence. They called her the Callahan Giantess, a name meant to isolate and diminish, but she wore their judgment like a cloak she couldn't be bothered to shrug off. Eli had watched her from a distance, another lost soul observing a fortress. He was leaning against the blacksmith's wall, trying to look like he had a purpose for being there, when her shadow fell over him. He looked up, his sun-dazzled eyes taking a moment to adjust to the sheer scale of her. She stood before him, her face unreadable, her gaze direct and assessing. It wasn't a look of pity or contempt, the two currencies he was most used to trading in. It was practical. It was the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking of buying, checking its teeth and the strength of its legs. "You're Eli Harper," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, a calm, resonant timbre that held no hint of question. He straightened up, a reflexive flicker of pride making him push his shoulders back. "Yes, ma'am. You lost your horse. You've got no work," again, a statement of fact, not an accusation. The whole town knew his business, but hearing it laid so bare from her lips was like being stripped naked in the public square. He could only nod, his throat tight. "My husband, Thomas, he's been gone a year," she continued, her eyes fixed on his. "The land needs more than one pair of hands. The fences are down in the south pasture. The well pump needs repair. The work is heavy," she paused, letting the silence stretch. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Harper. I need a husband." The word hung in the hot, still air between them, utterly unbelievable. Eli stared, certain he'd misheard, that the sun had finally cooked his brain. He saw the flicker of gossip from across the street, two women hiding their smirks behind their hands. "A husband?" he managed, the word tasting foreign. "A partner," she clarified, her expression unchanging. "A legal arrangement. You would have a roof over your head, food on the table, a stake in the work we do. In exchange, your name would afford me a certain protection, and your labor would keep the farm from falling into ruin." He understood. She wasn't offering romance. She was offering a contract, a lifeline. She was a woman of property, besieged by her solitude and whatever threats came with it. He was a man with nothing but a strong back and a name to lend. It was a trade. His pride, what little remained of it, bucked against the idea. To be a hired husband for the town spectacle? But then he felt the gnawing emptiness in his gut, the grit of the street under his worn boot soles. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only thing that mattered. He looked from her immense, steady form to the dusty, indifferent town that had already written him off. He thought of another night, sleeping in an alley, of the slow, grinding erosion of his own humanity. "The preacher can see us this afternoon," Maeve said, as if sensing the turn of his thoughts. The farm is a half-day's ride out. We can be there before sundown." He looked into her eyes, dark and deep as a well, and saw not a hint of guile. He saw pragmatism. He saw a resilience that dwarfed his own self-pity. In that moment, he realized she was just as desperate as he was, only her desperation was quieter, more dignified. "All right," Eli said, his voice raspy. "All right, Mrs. Callahan." "It will be Maeve," she corrected softly. And with that, the arrangement was sealed. Not with a handshake or a smile, but with a simple, stark acknowledgement of mutual need in the unforgiving Texas sun. The Callahan land was as vast and imposing as its mistress. It rolled out from the stark, two-story house in waves of sun-scorched grass and stubborn mesquite, stretching toward a horizon that shimmered with heat. The scale of it was daunting. It was a kingdom in disrepair, its potential buried under a layer of neglect born from a single pair of hands trying to do the work of four. The house itself was built to her proportions. The doorways were taller, the ceilings higher, the furniture sturdy and plain. As Eli stepped over the threshold, he felt himself shrink, a stranger in a land of giants. The air inside was cool and still, smelling faintly of soap, dust, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a permanent resident. That first night, they ate in a silence that was more solid than the wooden table between them. Maeve served him a stew, thick with potatoes and a little meat, and he ate with the single-minded focus of a starving man. He dared not look at her, keeping his eyes on his plate, acutely aware of her presence across from him. She was a mountain, and he was a stone at its base. The following morning, the work began. There were no gentle introductions or idle conversations. Maeve led him out into the dawn chill, the sky a pale, bruised purple, and laid out the day's tasks with the economy of a field general. "The fence along the creek is down. 3 sections. The posts are here. Wires in the barn. I'll be working on the well pump." She didn't watch him to see if he understood, didn't offer to help. She stated the need and trusted him to meet it. It was a test, he knew. He picked up the heavy post-hole digger, the familiar weight a small comfort, and headed toward the creek. The labor was brutal. The ground was hard, baked by a relentless sun. His hands, softened by weeks of idleness, blistered quickly. His muscles screamed in protest. But he didn't stop. He worked with a grim, punishing rhythm, driven by a desperate need to prove his worth, not just to her, but to himself. He was measuring himself against the ghost of her dead husband, against the whispers of the town, against the sheer, overwhelming presence of Maeve herself. Through the sweat and the ache, he watched her. She moved with an incredible, patient strength, dismantling the rusted well pump with a set of oversized wrenches. There was no wasted motion. Every turn of the bolt, every lift of a heavy component was done with a focused competence that was almost mesmerizing. She was not just a large woman. She was a capable one. He saw the intelligence in the way she diagnosed the problem, the raw power in the way she wrenched a corroded pipe free. They worked through the day in their separate spheres of labor, 2 solitary figures under an immense, indifferent sky. The only sounds were the clang of her tools and the thud of his digger against the earth. Yet, in this shared silence, a new language began to form. It was a language of effort, of sweat, of the visible progress marked by a newly set post or a reassembled pump. It was a communication devoid of words, but rich in meaning. At dusk, they returned to the house, coated in the grime of their work. He washed his hands and face at the basin on the back porch, the cold water a shock to his overheated skin. When he entered the kitchen, she had already set out plates of cold meat and bread. They ate again in silence, but this time it felt different. It was not the awkward silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of 2 people too tired for talk. After the meal, he took it upon himself to mend a broken latch on the screen door, the small scrape and click of the tools a soft counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets outside. He felt her watching him. He glanced over, and their eyes met for a brief, unguarded moment. He saw a flicker of something in her expression, not approval, exactly, but a kind of neutral acknowledgement. He had met the day's demands. He had not broken. He had earned his place at her table for one more night. As he lay in the small, stark bedroom down the hall from hers, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, Eli understood that respect on this land wasn't given. It was built one fence post, one repaired pump, one day of backbreaking work at a time. A month bled into the next, marked by the slow, steady rhythm of work and exhaustion. The trip to redemption for supplies was a necessary evil, a journey into a world that felt increasingly alien. As their wagon rumbled down the town's main street, Eli felt the familiar prickle of eyes on his back. The whispers were no longer just about the Callahan giantess, but about her and her new husband. He saw the sneers, the poorly concealed curiosity. Maeve sat beside him on the wagon bench, her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed ahead, an island of composure in a sea of petty judgment. She seemed impervious, but Eli noticed the tightness in her jaw, the way her large hands gripped the reins a little harder. He stayed close to her side as they moved from the mercantile to the feed store, his presence a silent, solid declaration. He was with her. Let them stare. It was outside the mercantile, as he was loading sacks of flour onto the wagon, that a man approached them. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, dressed in clothes too fine for the dusty town. A silver watch chain was looped across his vest. He moved with an air of unearned ownership, his smile thin and unpleasant. "Maeve, my dear cousin-in-law," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He tipped his hat, but the gesture was mocking. "I see you found yourself some help. Though I confess, I heard rumors you'd gone and gotten married." He let his gaze drift over Eli, a dismissive, insulting sweep from head to toe. "Seems the rumors were true." Maeve's face was stone. "Jared, this is my husband, Eli Harper." Jared Holt laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Husband? Maeve, a piece of paper from a preacher doesn't make a man. This land, Thomas's land, requires a firm hand. It's too much for you. And it's certainly too much for—" He trailed off, looking at Eli again with open contempt. "Someone like him." Eli felt a hot surge of anger. He set the last sack down with a heavy thud and straightened up, placing himself squarely between Holt and Maeve. He didn't say a word. He simply met Holt's gaze, his own expression flat and hard. He was smaller, poorer, and had no weapon, but he would not be cowed. He was no longer just a drifter. He was a man defending his ground, however new and strange that ground felt. Holt's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, surprised by the silent opposition. He had expected a hired hand who would shuffle his feet and look away. He hadn't expected this quiet defiance. "This isn't over, Maeve," Holt said, his voice losing its silken edge and taking on a venomous hiss. "That land is Holt land. It should have been mine. You, in your arrangement, won't change that." He shot one last hateful look at Eli before turning on his heel and striding away. The air, thick with tension, slowly began to thin. Maeve let out a breath she seemed to have been holding. She looked at Eli, her dark eyes searching his. He had not flinched. He had stood his ground for her. It was the first time anyone had. Her late husband, Thomas, had been a gentleman, often capitulating to his cousin's blustering demands for the sake of peace. Eli was not a gentleman. He was a hard man, forged by a hard life. And in that moment, she saw that his hardness could be a shield. The ride back to the farm was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than they had known before. The space between them on the wagon seat no longer felt like a chasm of awkwardness. It felt like a shared trench. They had faced a common enemy, and in doing so, had become allies. The hostile world outside had pushed them closer, binding them together with a threat more potent than any legal document. As the familiar silhouette of the farmhouse rose against the setting sun, it looked less like her house and more like their fortress. The confrontation with Jared Holt acted as a catalyst, transforming the nature of their work from maintenance to creation. It was no longer just about patching what was broken. It became about building something new, something that was theirs to defend. The unspoken understanding between them solidified into vocalized plans. One evening, sitting on the porch as the heat of the day finally broke, Maeve spoke into the quiet. The west pasture could support a dozen head of cattle, if we could get water to it. It wasn't a command, but an observation offered up for consideration. Eli, who had been watching the fireflies begin to duck the dusk, turned it over in his mind. There's that old dry well near the ridge, he mused. If we could dig it deeper, maybe build a trough system. The conversation flowed from there, a collaborative blueprint taking shape between them. They were no longer just Maeve Callahan and the man she'd married, but partners mapping out a future. Their days took on a new purpose. They worked side by side, their combined strength and knowledge a surprisingly potent force. Eli's wiry endurance complemented Maeve's raw power. He could work for hours under the sun without tiring, his movements efficient and practiced. She could lift beams and shift boulders that would take two men. Together, they began the arduous task of rehabilitating the west pasture. They dug out the old well, timbering its sides, their movements falling into an easy, synchronized rhythm. He would dig and fill the bucket. She would haul it up, her powerful arms making the task look effortless. They were a machine of two parts, perfectly fitted. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in from the plains, catching them off guard. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-black, and the wind tore at the roof of the old barn. Without a word, they scrambled to secure what they could. Eli climbed the rickety ladder to the hayloft to try and lash down a loose section of roofing, while Maeve wrestled the heavy barn doors closed against the gale. Rain fell in blinding sheets, soaking them in seconds. A powerful gust ripped a plank from Eli's hand, sending it cartwheeling into the darkness. He lost his footing, his boots slipping on the wet wood. For a heart-stopping moment, he dangled from the edge of the loft, the wind trying to peel him away. Below, Maeve saw him slip. A guttural cry of alarm tore from her throat. She moved with astonishing speed, positioning herself directly beneath him. "Let go, Eli," she yelled over the roar of the storm. "I'll catch you." He looked down into her upturned face, rain streaming down her cheeks, her eyes wide with fear for him. In that instant, he felt a surge of trust so absolute it stunned him. He let go. He fell, a dead weight, and landed in her arms. She staggered under the impact, but held firm, her strength a bedrock against the chaos of the storm. She lowered him to the ground, her hands lingering on his arms, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They stood there for a long moment, the storm raging around them, the shared terror and relief creating an intimacy more profound than any touch. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You saved me," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. Later that night, wrapped in dry blankets by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, the silence between them was charged with the memory of the storm. It had washed away the last of their pretenses. Thomas was afraid of storms, Maeve said softly, her gaze lost in the flames. He would hide in the cellar. It was the first time she had offered a detail of her past without being prompted. It was a small gift, a piece of her vulnerability. "I lost my family to a fever," Eli found himself saying, the words coming out before he could stop them. "A wife, a boy. Long time ago. That's when I started drifting." He had never told anyone that. The confession hung in the warm air, a fragile, aching truth. Maeve didn't offer platitudes or pity. She just nodded, a deep, slow acknowledgement of his pain. In the shared space of their past sorrows, the foundation of their strange new life settled, becoming something solid, something that felt impossibly like home. The seasons turned, and the rhythm of their life together deepened into a quiet harmony. The physical space between them, once a carefully maintained distance, began to narrow. It happened in small, almost imperceptible increments. A shared cup of coffee on the porch before the sun rose, their shoulders nearly touching. The way he would instinctively pass her the heaviest tools, and the way she would leave a plate of food warming for him on the stove when he worked past dark mending a harness. These were the unspoken words of a language they had invented together, a dialect of care and consideration. The hard lines of their arrangement had softened, blurring into something warmer, more complex. The house no longer felt like her domain that he was merely inhabiting. The scent of his wood smoke and leather was as much a part of it now as her soap and dried herbs. He was no longer just Mr. Harper, the hired husband. He was Eli. There was a growing awareness that simmered beneath the surface of their daily labors. A glance held a second too long across the dinner table. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as they both reached for a pail. Each instance was a small spark in the dry tinder of their shared solitude. Eli found himself watching her, not just as a work partner, but as a woman. He saw the way a stray strand of her dark hair would catch the light, the surprising gentleness in her large hands as she tended to a sickly calf, the quiet intelligence in her eyes as she surveyed the land they were healing together. He was no longer intimidated by her size. He was in awe of her strength, a strength that was not just physical, but was etched into the very core of her being. One night, after a long day of harvesting their first successful crop, a tangible sense of accomplishment hung in the air. The barn was full, the threat of winter lessened. They sat by the fire, a comfortable quiet settling around them. Eli looked at Maeve, her profile softened by the firelight, and the unspoken tension that had been building for months finally became unbearable. It was a precipice, and he knew they both stood upon its edge. He could let it pass, retreat to his room, and allow their relationship to remain in the safe, clear territory of partnership, or he could step forward into the unknown. He thought of the man he was when he arrived, empty and broken. He looked at the life they had built, the order they had carved from chaos. This was not just a contract. This was his life, and she was the center of it. He reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. It was a bold, terrifying gesture. Her hand was warm and strong in his, and she did not pull away. She simply turned her head and looked at him, her dark eyes wide and questioning. "Maeve," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He didn't need to say more. Everything was in that single word, in his touch. It was a question, an acknowledgement, an offering. He was crossing the threshold from his small, separate room into the heart of the house, into the center of her life, and asking to be let in. She searched his face, her own expression a mixture of apprehension and a deep, weary yearning. She had been alone for so long, barricaded behind her own strength and the world's judgment. To let someone pass those walls was a monumental risk. But she looked at Eli, at the sincerity in his weathered face, and saw not a threat, but a harbor. She gave his hand a slight, answering pressure. Later, in the quiet of her room, under the soft light of a single lamp, their marriage was consummated. It was not an act of fiery passion, but one of profound, searching tenderness. It was awkward and hesitant at first, two people unlearning loneliness. It was a slow, deliberate discovery, a final sealing of their pact. It was the quiet, solemn act of two solitary souls coming together, not out of convenience, but out of a deep, hard-won, and unspoken love. In the darkness, they did not feel like a giantess and a broken cowboy. They simply felt like a man and a woman, finally home. The fragile peace they had cultivated was not destined to last. News of their burgeoning success, of the Callahan farm slowly coming back to life, traveled back to redemption like a bad smell on the wind, and it found its way to Jared Holt. His envy, curdled by the public confirmation of Maeve and Eli's union, festered into active malice. The attacks began subtly, designed to demoralize and disrupt. One morning, Eli woke to find the gate to the west pasture thrown open, their small herd of cattle scattered for miles across the open range. It took them 3 grueling days on foot to round them all up. A week later, he found a rope to the well bucket deliberately frayed, nearly sending him plummeting into the darkness when snapped. These were not accidents. They were messages. They were Holt's way of saying, "This is still my land. You are trespassers." Each act of sabotage, meant to drive them apart, instead forged them into a more resilient unit. They became more vigilant, their shared purpose sharpened by the constant threat. Eli started walking the property line at dusk and dawn, his old rifle cleaned and ready. Maeve, with her intimate knowledge of every rock and ravine, pointed out the most vulnerable spots, the hidden trails an intruder might use. They worked as a single mind, anticipating Holt's next move, shoring up their defenses. The fear was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days, but it was overshadowed by a cold, shared resolve. Eli was no longer just protecting his stake in the farm. He was protecting Maeve. The thought of Holt bringing harm to her lit a fire in him, a cold, protective fury he hadn't felt in years. This was his wife. This was his home. The escalation was inevitable. One moonless night, a frantic bleating from the sheep pen jolted Eli from a light sleep. He grabbed the rifle and was out the door in an instant. In the murky starlight, he saw a figure slipping away from the pen, leaving the gate swinging wide. He saw something else, too. The dark, still form of you lying on the ground, its throat cut. A wave of pure rage washed over him. This was not just sabotage. This was blood. This was a violation. Holt! He roared into the darkness, his voice raw. He gave chase, his boots pounding the hard-packed earth. He caught up to the man at the edge of the creek bed. It wasn't Holt himself, but a wiry, sallow-faced man Eli recognized as one of Holt's known associates. The man spun around, a long knife flashing in his hand. He lunged. Eli sidestepped, bringing the butt of his rifle around in a hard, vicious arc that connected with the man's jaw. The man crumpled to the ground, groaning. Just as Eli stood over him, breathing heavily, another figure emerged from the shadows of the cottonwood trees. It was Jared Holt. "You should have stayed a drifter, Harper," Holt sneered, leveling a pistol at Eli's chest. "This land doesn't want you." Eli stood frozen, the rifle useless at his side. The metallic click as Holt cocked the hammer was deafeningly loud in the night. In that split second, Eli's only thought was of Maeve, alone in the house. He had failed. Then, a new sound cut through the tension. It was the unmistakable, double-barreled threat of a shotgun being cocked. From the darkness near the house, a voice boomed, deep and resonant with fury. "Get off my land, Jared." Maeve stood on the porch, a massive silhouette against the faint light from the doorway. In her hands, she held an old, heavy-gauge shotgun, and it was aimed squarely at her cousin-in-law. Her face was a mask of cold, absolute wrath. She was no longer just a landowner. She was a matriarch defending her territory, and she was terrifying. Holt's confidence evaporated. He stared at Maeve, then at Eli, his calculating mind weighing the odds. He saw the unyielding fury in Maeve's eyes and the murderous look on Eli's face. He lowered his pistol. "This isn't finished," he spat venomously. "Oh, yes, it is." Maeve's voice was deadly calm. "You will never set foot on this property again. If I see you, or any of your men, I will not hesitate." Holt grabbed his downed crony, pulling him to his feet. They backed away, stumbling into the darkness like the vermin they were. Eli watched them go, his heart still hammering against his ribs. He turned and looked at Maeve, standing like a colossus on the porch, the shotgun still held at the ready. She had saved him again. He walked towards her, the rifle hanging limply in his hand, and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. They looked at each other, their faces illuminated by the pale lamplight, and in that shared gaze, their pact was sealed not in ink or vows, but in blood and gunpowder. The violent confrontation with Holt left a strange and tense peace in its wake. They were hyper-aware, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of his return, but the immediate, physical threat seemed to have receded. He had seen their unified front, had felt the cold steel of their resolve, and for now, he kept his distance. The incident, however, had irrevocably altered the landscape of their relationship. The last vestiges of their original, pragmatic arrangement had been burned away in that moonless confrontation, leaving something raw, powerful, and undeniable in its place. They were no longer just partners. They were protectors of one another, their lives inextricably and fiercely bound. It was in the quiet aftermath of this violence that a new, even more profound change began to take root. It was Maeve who noticed it first, a subtle shift in her own body, a deep, unfamiliar weariness in the mornings that had nothing to do with farm work, a tenderness that was new. She kept it to herself for weeks, the possibility too fragile, too monumental to be given voice. A child had never been part of the bargain. It was a complication, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to even consider. She was the Callahan giantess, a woman defined by her strength and solitude. Motherhood felt like a role for a different kind of woman, a softer, smaller one. But the signs became undeniable, a quiet, insistent truth growing within her. One evening, as Eli was mending a bridle by the fire, she finally found the courage to speak. "Eli," she said, her voice softer than usual. He looked up, his hands stilling their work. She stood by the mantel, her large frame silhouetted against the flames, and placed a hand on her own stomach. "I think I'm with child." The words fell into the quiet room, and for a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Eli stared at her hand resting on her belly, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of her statement. A child, a baby. His mind reeled with a torrent of emotions. There was a sudden, soaring joy, an impossible hope he thought he had buried long ago with his first family. But hot on its heels came a wave of ice-cold fear. A child would make them a target in a way they had never been before. Holt's greed and hatred would surely be inflamed by the idea of a true heir to the Callahan land. The town's whispers and judgments would become a relentless storm, directed not just at them, but at an innocent. He saw the fear in Maeve's eyes, too. She was watching him, her stoic composure wavering, waiting for his reaction. She was offering him the most vulnerable part of herself, and she was terrified he would see it as a burden, a fatal flaw in their carefully constructed life. Eli dropped the bridle and rose slowly from his chair. He crossed the room and stood before her, his gaze falling to where her hand rested. All the fear, all the calculation, all the external threats seemed to fade away, replaced by a single, overwhelming feeling: awe. He reached out, his calloused, trembling hand covering hers. He could feel the faint, firm roundness beneath their joined hands. This was not a complication. This was not a burden. This was a miracle. This was life. This was theirs. A child, he breathed, the word full of wonder. He looked up from her belly and met her eyes, and his own were shining with an emotion she had never seen in him before. It was fierce, absolute devotion. Our child. In that moment, any lingering shadow of their original contract vanished forever. He was not a hired hand, and she was not just a landowner. He was a husband. She was his wife, and they were about to become a family. He gently pulled her into an embrace, his arms wrapping around her strong back, his face buried in her hair. She relaxed against him, a shudder of relief and profound emotion running through her. They stood there, holding each other, two solitary figures who had found not just a partnership, but a future, a legacy, growing in the quiet safety of the home they had fought for. The news of Maeve's pregnancy spread through redemption with the speed of a prairie fire, fanning the flames of Jared Holt's rage into a destructive inferno. An heir, a legitimate, blood-born heir to the land he considered his birthright. It was the final, unforgivable insult. His campaign of harassment had failed to break them. Now, desperation drove him to a more direct and brutal solution. He gathered two hard-faced men, drifters with nothing to lose, and promised them a share of the spoils. His plan was no longer to intimidate, but to eliminate. He would take the farm by force, drive Maeve off, and ensure Eli Harper was no longer a problem. The attack came at dusk, the time of day when shadows grow long and treacherous. Eli was securing the livestock for the night when the first shot rang out, splintering the wood of the barn door inches from his head. He dove for cover, his heart slamming against his ribs. He saw them then, Holt and his two thugs, advancing on the house with rifles raised. He was cut off, pinned down in the barn, his own rifle propped against the wall inside the farmhouse. Inside, Mae was alone and heavily pregnant. A primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He had to get to her. Inside the house, Maeve had heard the shot. She moved with a speed that belied her condition, her mind clear and cold with adrenaline. She bolted the thick oak door and grabbed the heavy shotgun from its place over the mantel. Her hands were steady as she loaded both barrels. Just then, a sharp, searing pain shot through her belly, making her gasp and lean against the wall. The baby. It was coming. Of all the damnable times, it was coming now. Another contraction seized her, fierce and demanding. She grit her teeth against it, her focus narrowing to two things: survival, and the child she would not let be born into violence and defeat. Eli, using the fading light and his knowledge of the terrain, made a desperate run from the barn to the house, shots kicking up dust around his feet. He scrambled through the back door, slamming it shut behind him just as a bullet shattered a window pane in the kitchen. He found Maeve in the main room, leaning against the wall, her face pale with pain, but her eyes blazing with defiance. "He's here," Eli panted, grabbing his rifle. "They mean to finish it." "The baby," she gasped, another wave of pain washing over her. "It's coming, Eli." His world tilted, the siege outside, the birth inside, the two fronts of an impossible war. He looked at her, at the sweat on her brow and the fierce resolve in her eyes, and his own fear was burned away by a surge of protective love. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice grim. "I won't let them touch you." The next few hours were a surreal nightmare. Eli moved from window to window, trading shots with the men outside, making their small fortress seem better defended than it was. Between contractions, Maeve would call out encouragement, her deep voice a lifeline in the chaos. The battle outside was a desperate struggle for their lives, while the battle inside was a primal, agonizing fight to bring a new one into the world. The sounds of gunfire and Maeve's pained cries merged into a terrifying symphony. As the siege wore on, Holt grew bolder, moving to set fire to the porch. It was then that Maeve, driven by a fierce maternal instinct, acted. During a lull in her labor, she dragged herself to a side window, the one Holt couldn't see from the front. She rested the heavy shotgun on the sill, took aim at the lantern he was about to throw, and fired. The blast shattered the night, the lantern exploding in a shower of glass and burning oil, forcing a screaming Holt to stumble back. The shot gave Eli the opening he needed. He burst from the back door, firing his rifle, a wild cry on his lips, catching the other two men by surprise. The ferocity of his counterattack, combined with the unexpected blast from the house, broke their nerve. They fled into the darkness, leaving a wounded Holt cursing on the ground. Eli subdued him, his rage cold and absolute, just as the long, piercing cry of a newborn baby echoed from the house. He ran back inside to find Maeve, exhausted but triumphant, holding a small, swaddled bundle. Their daughter, born amidst gunpowder and chaos, had arrived. Her name, they decided, would be June. Years spun by, weaving a new tapestry of life on the Callahan Harper farm. The world outside did not magically soften. In redemption, the whispers simply changed their tune. They were no longer about the Callian giantess and her hired husband, but about the giant's child, a girl who was growing as tall and unyielding as her mother. The stairs followed June down the main street, the same mix of curiosity and cruel judgment that had once plagued Maeve. But June met their looks with a steady gaze taught to her by a mother who knew the weight of such scrutiny and a father who had taught her the quiet power of defiance. They had forged their daughter in the fires of their own trials, armoring her not with bitterness, but with an unshakable sense of self. Their family life was a fortress built of love and labor. Maeve, whose hands could mend a broken wagon wheel, was impossibly gentle as she showed June how to braid her own long, dark hair. She taught her daughter the names of the wildflowers and the hardy plains grasses, how to read the clouds for rain, and how to stand tall in a world that would try to make her feel small. "Your size is a gift, June," Maeve would say, her voice a low, comforting rumble. "It means there is more of you to be strong. Never let anyone make you apologize for the space you take up." Eli, in turn, taught her the language of the land. He showed her how to mend a fence with wire and patience, how to soothe a nervous horse with a soft voice and a steady hand, how to feel the deep satisfaction of a day's hard work. He would read to her in the evenings by the firelight, his voice a calm counterpoint to the wind howling outside, filling her head with stories of courage and adventure. Their love for their daughter was not a thing of grand pronouncements or flowery words. It was in the steady, daily acts of teaching, protecting, and empowering her. The farm flourished under their combined efforts. The fields were green and productive, the cattle herd was healthy and growing, and the house, once a bastion of loneliness, was now filled with the sounds of a family. Laughter echoed in the kitchen. The scent of June's baking bread mingled with the smell of Eli's saddle soap. It was a sanctuary they had built with their own hands, a world unto itself where they were not defined by the town's narrow vision, but by their own strength and devotion. Jared Holt was a distant memory, a bitter ghost banished from their lives, serving a long sentence for his crimes. They had won. They had created a life of peace and substance from the dust and despair that had brought them together. There were moments of perfect, quiet beauty, the three of them sitting on the porch, watching the sun set the sky on fire, June leaning against Maeve's side, Eli's hand resting on his wife's shoulder. In these moments, Eli would look at Maeve, at the quiet contentment in her face, and feel a love so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. She was his anchor, his partner, his improbable, magnificent love. She had given him more than a home. She had given him back his own soul. The seasons continued their relentless cycle, and time, which had given Eli so much, eventually came to claim its due. Maeve passed away as she had lived, quietly, with immense dignity, leaving a silence in the house that felt as vast and profound as her presence had once been. The narrative of their lives together reached its final page, leaving Eli and a grown June to write the epilogue. They stood on the porch of the house built by resilience and love, the same porch where Maeve had sat for countless evenings and looked out over the land that was her enduring monument. The air was cool with the promise of autumn, and the wind whispered through the tall grass, a sound like a long, slow sigh. The grief was a fresh wound for Eli, a hollow ache that seemed to resonate in the very timbers of the house. He was an old man now, his body weathered by decades of labor, his heart heavy with the weight of her absence. He looked at June, standing beside him. She was a woman now, possessing her mother's remarkable height and her father's quiet resolve. Her face, framed by the same dark hair Maeve had, was turned toward the rolling plains, her expression thoughtful and serious. In her, Eli saw the perfect fusion of their improbable union. He saw Maeve's unyielding strength, her deep connection to the earth, her refusal to be diminished. He saw his own endurance, his capacity for quiet love, his unwavering loyalty. June was their legacy, a living, breathing testament to a love story that had begun not with a glance or a kiss, but with a desperate, pragmatic contract. He thought back to the man he had been, a ghost drifting through a dusty town with nothing to his name but failure. Maeve had not just offered him a roof. She had offered him resurrection. She had seen a strength in him he had forgotten existed and had given him a place to rebuild himself, piece by piece. She was a force of nature, a mountain who had sheltered him from the storm of his own despair and given him everything that mattered, a purpose, a home, and a daughter who was the anchor of his world now. "The fences in the west pasture will need checking before the first snow," June said, her voice carrying the same practical, resonant timbre her mother's had. It was not a question or suggestion, but a statement of fact, a continuation of the endless work the land required. Eli turned to look at her, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. He saw Maeve in that moment, so clearly it stole his breath, in the set of her shoulders, in the calm authority of her tone, in the proprietary way she surveyed their land. The cycle continued. The work went on. The strength was passed down. Maeve Callahan was gone from the world, but she was not gone from this place. Her echo was in the sturdy walls of the house, in the rustle of the crops, and most of all, in the heart of the tall, capable woman who stood beside him. Love, he mused, was rarely the thing you read about in books. Sometimes it was a bargain struck in desperation. Sometimes it was a partnership forged in hardship and silence. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it grew into something strong enough to outlast the storms, something that left behind a legacy of unyielding strength. He looked at his daughter, the living, breathing proof of it all, and felt a profound, aching peace settle over him. Their story was not over. It would be carried forward as strong and steadfast as the land itself.